Welcome to Bizarre Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Bizarre Podcast. I hope you're all doing well. On today's episode, I have a ghost story for you, a haunted house story. But this haunted house was not plagued by one ghost, but three, and something else, something evil. And this haunting took place over a 15-year time period, which beckons a question: why not move house? Would you? I know I would. Well, consider this. What if the ghost followed you wherever you went? I give you the Smurl family haunting. Now, before we get onto the actual haunting, let me first tell you a little bit about the Smurl family. Jack and Janet both worked for the same confectionery company, Top Chewing Gum, but they met for the first time at the company Christmas party in 1967, and instantly they both knew that they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. And the year after, they were both wed, on December the 28th, 1968. The happy newlyweds moved in with Jack's parents, John and Mary Smurl, who lived in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. By 1969, Janet gave birth to the first daughter, Dawn, and life was good. Janet quit her job to be a stay-at-home mother, and of course Jack's parents were also there to lend a helping hand with the baby. And like I said, life was kind of good at Smurls. The situation suited them well, and things seemed to be on the up. That is until 1972, when Hurricane Agnes came down upon Pennsylvania, which caused the embankment holding the Susquehanna River at bay to break, sending the water straight towards the Smurl house as well as many more. 12 foot of water now occupied the family home. The family tried their best to renovate the property, but the damage was just too great, and they started to look for a new property that could accommodate John and Mary Smurl and Jack and Janet Smurl and their ever-growing family, because by 1972, Jack and Janet had welcomed their second child, Heather. They needed a bigger property to house the entire family, and they settled on a house that was situated in a nearby town, and that town was West Pittston. Now, West Pittston was a quaint little town with tragedy written into its past. The town was built upon a system of underground caves, and West Pittston saw many mining disasters and cave-ins over the years, which resulted in over 50 houses being swallowed up by the earth. It was also said that during the excavations of the cave systems, pig bones were found displayed in the shape of a pentagram. The old house that awaited the Smurls was quite big. It was one of a kind. It had been built in 1896, and at this time in history it would have sat alone in an empty field. But by 1950, construction started on more family homes that joined the old house. And at some point over the years, the old house had been split down the middle into two separate apartments, a duplex. This house was just perfect for the Smurls, and the address was 328 330 Chase Street. And even though this house lay vacant, something inside awaited to greet them in its own special way. Now, Jack and Janet and the two children moved into the left-hand side of the house, whilst John and Mary moved into the right-hand side of the house, and both sides required renovation. The house was outdated, and there was a smell that hung in the air, the kind old houses normally produce. The wallpaper needed to be stripped, and the bathrooms were outdated and had seen better days, and there were also stains that lay upon the floors. But the two families rolled up their sleeves and got down to work. John Smurl was actually a very good electrician, and he was no stranger to a little bit of plumbing, and Jack knew a thing or two about DIY as well. The house seemed perfect, and life seemed perfect, but all of that was about to change. Now, like many hauntings, the activity actually started small, bumps and bangs and things disappearing and then reappearing. But the first major incident started when John and Mary bought a bright red carpet for their half of the duplex a couple of months after moving in. The carpet was fitted and the elderly couple were very pleased. As you can imagine, I'm sure many of you out there know what it's like to move into a new house, do renovations, do lots of work on the house, and then at last you get your new carpet fitted, and the room is kind of filled with this new carpet smell, covering the smell of the old house. And it's a great feeling, isn't it, to finally get that nice clean carpet fitted after all the work is done. And it must have felt like real progress to John and Mary Smurl. But 2 days later, Mary Smurl awoke in the morning. She ventured downstairs to find her beautiful new red carpet had a big black greasy stain right in the middle of it. And they were actually clueless as to where the stain had come from, and it baffled Mary and John. But they managed to clean the stain away from the carpet. But a few days later, to their shock and frustration, the stain returned. There was absolutely no explanation, and once again, the same spot was cleaned. A few days later, the stain returned again, and out of frustration, John ripped up the carpet and the couple purchased a brand new one, and luckily no stain ever materialised. Murray and John just put it down to a defect maybe, a strange, unexplainable defect. Whilst at the same time, on the opposite side of the duplex, Janet and Jack were also having issues. They found that no matter how many fresh coats of paint they put on the walls, stains would always appear, as though they rose up from below the paint. And it actually got so bad that in the end, Jack decided that he would be fitting wood panellings to the wall to overcome this problem. Now you could say that these are just everyday problems that come with renovating an old house. Or, in hindsight, you could say it was almost as though something did not like the changes being made to the house. Or maybe it was just taking delight in causing so much trouble. When the decorating was complete on Jack and Janet's side of the duplex, it was time for their own red carpet to be fitted, and this time, there was no stains. For a good while there was no real activity. Like I said before, the family heard bumps and bangs, but all of this could be explained as the house settling. Personal belongings did go missing, and of course, the children were the number one suspect and they were questioned. By 1974, the family was somewhat settled in their homes, and that is when the activity started to ramp up a little, starting with a television set that suddenly burst into flames as Jack sat watching his programs. As far as he could tell, when he actually put the fire out, the TV was fine. The electrics in the house were sound. Remember, his father was a good electrician. Maybe the TV was just faulty. After all, what else could the explanation be? But the TV was not the only household appliance to set on fire. For the longest time, Janet had been using the stove that actually came with the house, and it was old, it was very old. But the day came when they could afford a brand new modern stove, out with the old and in with the new. But that too would burst into flames for no apparent reason, and Janet had to use a fire extinguisher to put out the fire, and the stove wasn't even being used at the time when it set ablaze. But strange fire-related activity was not exclusive to the house, as one day whilst Jack was driving home from work, he could hear strange sounds coming from somewhere in the car. Jack managed to pull the car over just before flames burst from beneath the hood and smoke billowed out. Now, you could argue that these things just happen, and that's exactly what the Smurls thought at this point. It was just a string of bad luck, and maybe it was. But fire was not the only element plaguing the Smurls, and before we go on, let me remind you that John, Jack's father, was a dab hand at DIY, and he had fixed up both sides of the duplex when it came to the plumbing. There should have been no issues. But leaks were a common hindrance for the Smurls. Water would often be spilling out from under the sink cabinet in the kitchen and also from the bathroom. And John of course presumed there was a leaky pipe, but upon inspection, the pipes were just fine. It also got so bad at one point that the basement even flooded. On one occasion, Jack got down under his own sink to stop a leak, and he was unable to lay his hand on his wrench, which he had placed down just seconds before, and it had simply vanished. Jack decided that he could use his hammer to finish the job, and when he had finished, he was shocked to see that his wrench had reappeared. It was back where he had originally left it, like it was mocking him. And then the time came for Jack and Janet to fit their brand new bathroom, and even more destruction took place. The bathroom was installed, and it was beautiful, and they said goodbye to the old, crummy, outdated one, and welcomed in the new clean sink and bathtub. The bathroom had not long been installed before one morning as Jack rose from bed to find that the new bathroom had been severely scratched and chipped in places. It was a dreadful sight. It was only the night before that it was shiny and new. These scratch marks would also appear on Jack's freshly painted woodwork around the house. So far, the haunting had only been an inconvenience to the Smurls. Fires, water damage, scratch marks, stealing personal belongings, all of these things can be explained. Your mind does not automatically go to ghosts must have done this. That is until the ghosts started to appear before their very eyes. Now, the first member of the family to see something strange and unexplained was Jack and Janet's 6-year-old daughter, Dawn, and it happened one night as she lay in bed trying to sleep, which was proving difficult due to the thunderstorm that was taking place that night. She lay in bed staring up at the shadows on her ceiling when all of a sudden the shadow shifted into the shape of a person, and then from the foot of her bed another shadow person appeared, who then floated up to the ceiling to join the other figure, and then another came out of her closet, which also joined the other shadow figures, and they all kind of floated around the ceiling above her. Dawn ran from her room as fast as she could, and into her parents' bed. She dove in between her mother and her father. Janet asked her daughter what was the matter, and then when Dawn told her about the shadow figure floating in her room, Janet simply put it down to a nightmare brought on by the thunderstorm, and did what all parents would do in that situation: try to reassure her daughter that that was exactly what it was. As Janet was explaining to her daughter that she had simply had a nightmare, Dawn looked over her mother's shoulder and let out a scream. According to Dawn, standing beside the bed was a white female figure, and before Janet could turn around, the figure had vanished. And of course, as you can imagine, for the remainder of the night, Dawn slept with her parents. So far, Dawn was the only person to see something with her own eyes, but still, this was coming from a 6-year-old child, and it was not taken seriously. After all, kids have an active imagination, so Dawn must have been having a nightmare, right? The next paranormal activity to occur came one night as Jack sat in the living room, when all of a sudden he heard the sound of a toilet flushing from upstairs. Nothing unusual there. Moments went by and the toilet flushed again, and then over and over and over again, one after the other. Jack decided to venture upstairs and he inspected the cistern and adjusted the float. He placed the lid back down on the toilet and walked away. He had only taken a few steps out of the bathroom when the toilet flushed again. On another day, Janet was slightly spooked by the kitchen radio turning on all by itself. As she went to turn it off, she noticed with her own eyes that the volume dial was turning by itself, pumping up the volume. Janet reached for the plug and pulled it free from the socket. There was a moment of silence before the radio in her bedroom also started playing. The volume cranked up and Janet rushed upstairs and reached for the plug, only to find that it wasn't even plugged in. And then the radio cut off abruptly. On one particular day, Jack returned home to find it was empty and he had the house to himself, which I must admit is a nice feeling at times. Jack went to turn on the TV set, but he was distracted with the sound of footsteps coming from the floor above, and then he heard what he believed was the sound of a drawer opening in one of the bedrooms, and then the sound of a closet closing. He dashed upstairs, probably thinking that there was an intruder in his house, only to find nothing at all out of place. Time passed, and bumps and bangs and items vanishing continued. Janet would give birth to the twins, Karen and Shannon, who would move into Heather's room, whilst Heather moved in with Dawn, which must have been a relief to the little girl to have someone else in her bedroom, apart from the shadow figures that floated around her ceiling on certain nights. One night as Janet and Jack lay in bed, they were disturbed by the sound of creaking coming from downstairs, whilst the rest of the family were sound asleep. Jack and Janet crept downstairs and noticed the sound getting louder and louder as they neared the front door. The sound was coming from outside on the porch. Jack opened the front door and peered out to see 2 old rocking chairs rocking back and forth. This was not with the wind. It looked as though the chairs were rocking slowly and deliberate, as though someone unseen was sat rocking away, and then they suddenly stopped dead. Now, I must admit the timeline in the story is a little bit hard to pin down, but I think at around this point in the story we're around 1982 or 1983, and things were about to escalate. Bumps and bangs were now joined by overpowering bad smells, and the family were of the Catholic faith, and prayer was part of the routine. And sometimes during these prayers, the smell would fill the room and become overpowering. One night as Jack lay asleep in bed, he was awoken by a touch to the arm, the kind of touch that suggested to him that his wife wanted a certain kind of affection. Eager, Jack turned around to face his wife, only to find that she was sound asleep and facing the opposite way, and yet he could still feel the gentle touch caressing his shoulder. Now, at this point, the twins were now around 5 years old, and Dawn was now a teenager, and Eva only a few years behind. The family decided to bring a dog into the family, a German Shepherd, and they named him Simon. Maybe the presence of a dog would make the family members feel a little safer if they were home alone. But that's not to say that the dog also didn't suffer under the phantom hands of the unwanted house guests, which we'll get into a little bit later. One day, whilst Janet was down in the basement loading some washing into the machine, all of a sudden she heard a voice call out her name. It sounded just like Jack's mother, Mary, who must have come over to visit. Janet shouted up that she was in the basement, but the voice continued to shout her name, but this time it sounded just like her sister. Janet stood at the bottom of the stairs staring up at the doorway, hoping her mother-in-law or sister would appear, but they didn't. Instead, a name was once again called out, but this time from inside the basement directly behind her. And then it called her name again, this time even closer. And with that, Janet ran as fast as she could up the stairs and slammed the door behind her. And I'll just add, in the following years, the entity mimicked other family members, voices such as Janet's kids calling out Mum repeatedly when they were not even home, and sometimes it mimicked Jack's voice. And this was from all around the house, not just in the basement. Now, Janet could not ignore what had just happened, and when she thought about everything else that had happened, the fires, the leaks, the rocking chairs, her own daughter witnessing the shadow people in her room, it had dawned on her that the house just might be haunted. Not to mention that one of her twin daughters, Karen, had also started to see things in the house. She had woke up one night to see a black shadow figure stood beside her toy box. It looked like a man, and the man was looking directly at her from the darkness. But this dark mass had no features. It was just the shape of a person. This entity would visit Karen on more than one occasion, always in the same spot, beside her toy box. She even started to refer to him as the man in the box. Janet believed her daughter. She felt she was being truthful. Janet and Jack were not the only ones experiencing strange things. Jack's parents were also hearing the same bumps and bangs and things vanishing like Murray's jewellery. And even spoons were vanishing one by one before reappearing a few days later, two at a time throughout the day, until a week later all the spoons were accounted for. But the activity was about to escalate for Murray and John. On one particular day, Jack's aunt paid John and Murray a visit, and while sat in the living room chatting, they could hear the unmistakable sound of Janet and Jack arguing from the other side of the wall. Something that was unusual. Jack and Janet rarely argued. But this argument was very volatile and intense. Vulgar profanities were passed back and forth. Real explicit words that you wouldn't normally hear coming from the mouth of Janet and Jack. And Murray, Jack's mother, was disgusted to hear this kind of language coming from her own son and his wife. Later that day, Janet decided to visit next door. She knew that Jack's aunt was visiting and thought it would be nice to catch up. But upon arrival, she was not shown the same welcome she normally received. Jack's mother and aunt looked angry with her, and for what, she had no idea. And when they told her, she insisted that her and Jack had no such argument. It simply did not happen. Jack had actually left for work that morning, and Janet had been alone all day. And yet Jack's aunt and mother insisted that they could hear the explosive arguments from next door. They simply did not believe her, and Janet left bewildered. It was like the entity wanted to destroy this family that was so close to one another. And I just want to add before we move on that this happened on many different occasions, not just to John and Murray, but also to Janet and Jack. On one particular night, whilst Janet and Jack were sat in bed, they could hear his mother on the other side of the wall rant and shout at his father. And that was so out of character. It just couldn't have been her doing it. And it wasn't. This did happen a few years down the line, like I said, but it happened so many other times where the entity was mimicking people in the house. On some days, Janet would return home from shopping to find that her front door was wide open. She'd locked it before she left, she was sure of this. And when she went into the house, she couldn't find the dog anywhere. Janet had left him in the front room with the TV on as company, but now the TV was switched off and the dog was missing. Janet eventually did find Simon, the dog, in the backyard. The back door was locked. It was locked when she left the house, it was locked when she returned. So how did the dog get into the backyard? It was as though the dog teleported from the front room into the backyard. It was freezing outside and the dog would not have been left out by anyone else in the family. There was simply no explanation for how the dog got out there, but Janet kind of just shrugged this off. And later that day, as Janet stood ironing in the cold house, probably wondering how the dog got outside or why the front door was left wide open, a black mass suddenly appeared. It emerged from the wall in the living room, like a mist or smoke that floated through the air. The black, transparent mass gave off a foul smell as its form grew to the height of a man. It floated towards her and then past her as she stood frozen, and then the black mass floated into the living room and vanished through the wall. And directly on the other side of that wall was John and Murray's living room. Janet rushed next door to find Murray in a rocking chair, scared stiff. Murray had also witnessed this black mass float into her home, and it moved towards the old woman and then simply vanished. As horrible as this was, at least the two women could take some kind of comfort in knowing that they had seen the same thing. After the sighting of the black mass, the haunting seemed to take a break for a few weeks. But in hindsight, this was most definitely the calm before the storm. On April the 29th, 1985, Janet sat in her kitchen helping make adjustments to Heather's confirmation dress, which, as we know, is a religious event, a happy event. Maybe that's why the entity decided to strike. Maybe it was waiting for this opportunity to ruin a very special day. Janet sat at the kitchen table with Heather making adjustments to her dress, while 6-year-old Shannon stood near the refrigerator, when all of a sudden she heard a noise coming from above. Directly above was a 4-foot-long fluorescent ceiling light that came crashing down. It would have hit the mother and daughter if Janet had not acted quickly and pulled them both under the kitchen table. Unfortunately, Shannon was just out of reach, and the light fitting caught the 6-year-old on the head, cutting her deep, so deep that she needed stitches. This changed things. Now the entity was trying to harm the children, and it would not be for the last time. Only a few nights later, 6-year-old Shannon climbed from her bed to go to the toilet as the rest of the family slept. As she made her way to the bathroom, she was pushed by unseen hands down the stairs, hitting every step on the way down before crashing at the bottom. The noise awoke her parents, who ran to her aid. So far, the thing in the house that lived with them had only been a terrifying nuisance, but this was the second time that it had targeted Shannon. So the decision was made that the Smurl family would take a little camping trip away from the house to get away from the voices in the pillows as they tried to sleep, the constant bumps and bangs, and the shadow people, not to mention the man next to Karen's toy box who paid her a terrifying visit on certain nights. Before the family left for their camping trip, they left a few lights on in the house to trick would-be burglars from knowing that they were out. They locked up and went on their way, and whilst they were gone, the house came alive. Whilst the Smurls were gone on their camping trip, neighbours were stood outside on the street, looking upon their house. Lights were flashing on and off inside the house. The light show was accompanied by blood-curdling screams, the most horrendous screams that you had ever heard, that sounded like some people were being murdered inside of the house, whilst at the same time, they could hear the strange sound of flapping wings, something that was actually heard inside the house by visitors on a few occasions. It was like the house was angry that the Smurls had left it. Now, a month or so after the communion, Jack lay in his bed. Janet had took the children clothes shopping, but Jack decided to stay behind as he did not feel well. Eventually, he did manage to fall asleep. An unknown amount of time went by when Jack opened his eyes, only to find that he was very close to the ceiling. I can only imagine the confusion he must have felt after waking from his slumber. He quickly realised that he was floating above the bed, being held up in the air by some unseen force, and without warning, it let him fall back down to the bed. Now, I'm sure many of you can relate to this feeling of falling from a height, and it jolts you awake just as you're falling asleep. It is very unnerving. It's happened to me on many occasions, but I can't say that I've ever awoke to find myself floating close to the ceiling. On another night after church, John and Murray returned home to find the front door wide open, just like Janet did not that long ago. The couple entered the house with caution and headed to the kitchen, only to find that Murray's china cabinet, full of china plates and cups, had been moved from one side of the room to the other, and everything was in place. Not one piece was broken. This, of course, gave the old couple a fright, especially Murray, who had just actually recovered from a heart attack, and the last thing that she needed was a scare, and maybe the entity knew that. On another day, Janet stood in the bathroom, whilst unseen forces proceeded to push Janet around the room over and over, unrelenting. She felt it was trying to push her into the bathtub that was full of water. It didn't give up as she grabbed the safety handle on the tub, trying with all her might not to fall into the water. What would happen if she did fall in? Would it be able to hold her under the water? If it could push her with such force and direct her towards the tub, I'm guessing it probably could have, if it wanted to. Luckily, Jack arrived at the door and the pushing stopped. Now, I'm not sure whether Janet actually took a bath that night after that terrifying attack, but I can tell you this, if that happened to me, I would have probably just had a good wash at the sink. Now, as terrifying as all this was, you've got to remember this was happening constantly to the Smurls. It was also as though the family were getting familiar with the tricks that the entity played on them, and it annoyed them. If something went missing, they would shout out at the entity for taking their stuff. It kind of became almost normal. And the same old annoyances continued, like things going missing and reappearing, bumps, bangs, doors slamming, lights being turned on and off, Janet's name being called out by a phantom voice that could mimic family members. From this point on, just rest assured that these things were happening all of the time, and if it did lessen, it was only for a short while. It was almost as though this kind of activity did not exactly scare the family anymore, it just annoyed them. But there was much more worse acts the entity could inflict. On one particular night, Janet and Jack had just finished making love, and they rested when something grabbed Janet's leg from the covers and pulled her from the bed naked. Jack reached out and grabbed her arm as she was being pulled around the room, and as hard as he tried, he could not pull her back onto the bed, when all of a sudden, the thing that had his wife forced him down onto the bed, and he lay there unable to move as Janet screamed from the floor of the dark bedroom. All of a sudden, it just simply let go of both of them. Janet returned to Jack on the bed as the whole room went crazy. Things were flying around the walls, thudding and banging, and all of this was accompanied by the same foul smell that turned up every now and again. Now, days later, the entity attacked the dog Simon. I just love that they named the dog Simon. I don't know why, I find that amusing every time I utter the words. Now, Simon the dog had possibly already suffered at the hands of the entity. Of course, it was home alone a lot of the times, and then there was a time when it was teleported into the back garden in the freezing cold weather. But this time, Janet witnessed how cruel the thing could be towards her dog with her own eyes, as Simon was levitated into the air in front of Janet and thrown at the wall with force. And then the dog came crashing down to the ground, looking bewildered, as though he was being punished in the most horrendous way for something he hadn't done. On another occasion, Simon the dog yelped out in pain as something invisible attacked it, and all the dog could do was take the beating until it was over. Next door, Murray and John did not own an animal, and yet Murray claimed that she was attacked by a strange dog one night as John was out having a drink. Now, the strange thing about this dog is that it was headless and tailless, and it attacked Murray's feet. And it did this as she watched TV before it disappeared under the couch, and when John returned home that night, he looked underneath the couch and, of course, found nothing at all. One day, the twins, who were now 7 years old, came running down the stairs, crying their eyes out, insisting that a flying animal was flapping its wings around their heads, but it was invisible, they could only hear it. Janet ventured upstairs to find absolutely nothing at all. And on another occasion, Janet and Jack lay in bed one night and witnessed a white mist enter the bedroom through the window and form into a human figure in front of their very eyes, and then simply disappeared. After all of this strange activity, the family finally decided to get a blessing from the church. Why they did not do this sooner is beyond me. The priest arrived and blessed every single room, and he claimed he could feel that something unearthly was sharing the house with them. The blessing seemed to take its toll on the man, and by the time he had finished, he looked tired and washed out. And as he left, he wished them all the best, and if the strange happenings continued, then they should contact him immediately. And for a few days, the activity did die down, but I'm guessing you already know, this was not the end. One night, as Murray lay in bed reading her book, she couldn't help but notice the bed rumble beneath her. Before she could get off the bed, the mattress rose into the air, a good few feet. Shouting for her husband John was a waste of time because John had gone out for a game of cards. Seeing no option, Murray jumped from the bed, hitting the floor hard and hurting her knees, as the mattress also came crashing back down onto the bed frame. And once again, the family called for a priest, and once again the house was blessed, and just like before, there was peace. Peace that lasted only a few days before the terror returned. The entity also seemed to be inappropriately mischievous. Once when Janet took off her clothes and slipped into the warm steamy bathtub, she was horrified to hear creepy wolf whistles as she lay there exposed to the invisible thing that watched her in the bathroom. Janet was not the only victim of the ghostly wolf whistles. It also targeted Jack's mother Mary and Dawn, who was now 16 years old. It seemed to enjoy making the women feel uncomfortable in this new creepy way. It was as though it had learned a new trick, and it was eager to show them what it was. But whistling was not the only thing that it had learned. It also learned how to hum a tune to whoever was alone in the house. A tune no one knew, but it was a tune nonetheless. Things seemed hopeless. The blessings were not working and the family were at their wits' end. Was this now forever? Would it ever leave them alone? Many people have asked over the years, if the house was haunted, if it was so horrific, then why not just leave? but the Smurls had a lot of money tied up into the house and feared that Jack's mother would not survive another move. But there was another reason. According to the Smurls, the entity followed them wherever they went. Their situation was hopeless, and they needed help. And this is where Ed and Lorraine Warren come into this disturbing story. Janet had heard of a couple who held lectures in the paranormal and offered their services to anyone going through any kind of haunting. The couple were Ed and Lorraine Warren. Ed and Lorraine Warren founded the New England Society of Psychic Research. Ed Warren was a self-professed demonologist, author and lecturer, whilst Lorraine was a clairvoyant and a light trance medium who claimed to have psychic abilities that allowed her to perceive spirits and supernatural phenomena. And it just so happened that Ed and Lorraine Warren were holding a lecture at the nearby college, and Janet, at her wit's end, attended to seek them out. Hopefully they could help her family. The Warrens arrived at the Smurl family home on February the 14th, 1986, Valentine's Day. They also brought with them a young woman named Diane Hayes to help them. Diane was an avid librarian and had some psychic abilities. The Warrens sat down at the Smurls' coffee table and set up their tape recorder as Janet and Jack filled them in on all of the paranormal activity that had taken place around the duplex. The Warrens had worked on many a haunting, including the Amityville case, and were no strangers to the haunted house. They also had their own questions to ask, such as, has anyone in the family ever played with a Ouija board, or are they practicing witchcraft? Things like that. The Smurls held a strong Catholic faith, and it never faltered, and the answer was a resounding no. The next step was for Diane and Lorraine to walk the house from room to room to see if they could pick up on any presence in this property, to make sense of what was happening to this down-to-earth family. When the women reached the second floor of the house, they could definitely feel something heavy and thick. Lorraine explored all of the rooms, the bathroom where Janet had been pushed over the tub, the kids' bedrooms where the shadow figure stands on certain nights beside the toy box, and Jack and Janet's bedroom where Jack and Janet have both been physically assaulted. Lorraine could definitely feel a presence in the house, and whilst the two women walked around upstairs, they were hit by an intense, unpleasant smell that made them retreat back downstairs. Lorraine sat down at the coffee table, took a breath, and proceeded to give the Smurls the bad news. Lorraine informed them that there were 4 spirits in their house. The first seemed to be that of an older woman who was not aggressive or dangerous and possibly still senile, even after death. The second was a young woman who was aggressive and violent and liked to harm the family. The third was a spirit of a tall man with a mustache, who possibly died in the house and is also very violent and intended to do harm. And he also may have harmed someone in this house at some time in the past, in his living years. And the fourth spirit was a demon. After this shocking bit of information, and after interviewing John and Murray, Lorraine Warren once again walked the house, followed by an assistant with a video camera, as she documented all of the activity on film. Afterwards, Ed Warren wanted to try and draw out the demon in Jack and Janet's bedroom. He did this by brandishing his Bible, rosary beads, and his crucifix, and a recording of a spiritual hymn. And at first, nothing happened. But upon the second attempt, the bedroom came alive. The TV glowed, although not turned on, and a loud roar came from all around them. The set of drawers opened and shut, and the bedroom mirrors swung back and forth. The room had turned into a room of horrific chaos. Ed, using his crucifix, holy water, and Bible, commanded the demon to be gone, and eventually it did calm down. They had successfully drawn out the demon. The Warrens advised the Smurls to stock up on holy water, religious candles, and sage, and learn the prayer that Ed had just recited. And most of all, do not lose faith. And if the demon returns, they should phone the church and ask for an exorcism. And with that, the Warrens left. That night, as the Smurl family lay in bed, the bumps and bangs started to sound out from all over the house, gradually getting louder and louder, until it was almost too loud to think, and they came in rapid succession. It sounded as though a wrecking ball was smashing into the house from all sides, and it carried on for hours, until 3 a.m. when it suddenly stopped. The house was quiet for a few nights after this until the activity picked up again, but this time Jack would see the ghost with his own 2 eyes. It came one night as Jack lay in bed fast asleep, but he was suddenly awoken by whispering voices from the foot of the bed. He cautiously peered towards the foot of the bed to see 2 ghostly women having a conversation about Jack as they stared directly at him. Although he could not make out what they were saying, it was just ghostly whispers that was not exactly clear to the human ear. One of the women was clearly older than the other, and they both wore clothing that maybe came from the 1600s or the 1700s. They wore long dresses, aprons, and bonnets, and they were perfectly clear to the human eye, but void of colour, and they also gave off this luminescence. They gave off this strange glow, and without warning, they simply faded away before Jack's eyes. Jack, who was already exhausted, momentarily fell back asleep before once again being awoken by the same ghostly whispers, but this time the two glowing women were now right next to him, both of them whispering to each other whilst staring at Jack. Jack tried to wake Janet, but she was unresponsive. This was something the demon would often do, put one family member in a trance and then terrorise the other one. The two spirits seemed to take delight in Jack's terror. They laughed at him and gave him grotesque grins until disappearing once again into the darkness of the closet that was in Jack and Janet's bedroom. A few days later, the Warrens sent over two psychic researchers to help the Smurls, and all they really did was ask the same types of questions, set up a tape recorder and record bumps and bangs from around the house. The two researchers were also assaulted by the foul odours that seemed worse in Janet and Jack's bedroom, the hotspot for the activity. The next day, they packed up and returned to the Warrens to share what they found. When March rolled around, the Warrens returned to the house with their own small team of paranormal investigators, a medical examiner, and a police officer. Lorraine once again walked the house like she had done previously and sat down with the Smurls to talk whilst the children were at school. Lorraine was about to tell them something they probably didn't want to hear. She claimed that when she was walking the rooms upstairs, she stepped into the Smurls' eldest daughter's bedroom and she felt a presence, accompanied by a scratching sound at the window, and that's when she saw it, a black mass floating on the outside of the window, scratching at the glass. Ed had managed to find them another priest to come and bless the house, and when he arrived, he seemed somewhat half-hearted, like he did not really want to be there, not out of fear, but maybe he thought that all of this was one big hoax. After the priest had left, Ed suggested that the family go out for dinner and leave him and Lorraine in the house alone, so that they could do their job. When the Smurls had left, Ed went up to Janet and Jack's bedroom and started to pray. The Warrens had no intention of leaving this time. They planned to stay the night and try something different to draw out the demon. They were going to provoke it. The air in the room was thick and heavy. There was no question that the demon was here, right now, with Ed. And this was confirmed when the demon grabbed Ed by the throat and continued to choke him as it pushed him onto the bed. Ed was on the verge of passing out, but before this happened, he envisioned a bright light covering his body and Jesus Christ. And by sheer faith, he was able to push the demon back into the shadows. Ed next ventured into the children's bedroom where Lorraine had seen the black mass clawing at the window, and he proceeded to recite his prayer to provoke the demon. As Ed glanced over to the mirror in the child's bedroom, he could see words forming. The demon was actually spelling something out for him. He watched in horror as each letter formed, and eventually the words read,
"You filthy bastard, get out of this house."
Ed continued in all the rooms. When he made it downstairs, he noticed Lorraine comforting one of the team members who had apparently been shaken by the entity. And when I say shaken, I mean the assistant was physically shaken by the demon. Apparently this thing was very strong and it could attack people upstairs and downstairs at the same time. It's safe to say that the demon did seem pretty pissed off with the arrival of the Warrens, and every time the demon got angry, it took it out on the Smurls. The activity ramped up. Jack was bitten on multiple occasions by something invisible, whilst Mary, Jack's mother, saw the black mass in her home while she was home alone, and it was kind of blocking her escape, keeping her in the room, and it was also motioning for her to come closer, which of course she didn't do. And then we get back onto poor Simon the dog, who was teleported in front of Janet. The dog vanished and reappeared in a state of shock. But the demon was about to turn it up a notch and do something unthinkable to Jack. On one particular night, Jack was fast asleep in bed when he was suddenly awoken, as though awaking from a nightmare. He heard a sound from his side of the bed, from the closet doors that had been closed when Jack fell asleep, but were now wide open. Remember earlier when the two women ghosts were laughing and giggling at Jack? They disappeared into the closet doors, And it was said that Lorraine and Ed Warren thought that these closet doors were a hot spot for the activity. They thought the demon was actually using these closet doors to take itself from one side of the duplex to the other. This was how it was actually getting around. Now, Jack could see a dark form approaching his side of the bed from the shadow of the closet, and as the figure came closer, Jack could see that the demon had taken on the form of an old hag with white hair and red burning eyes. Jack was totally alone. Janet had chosen to sleep downstairs that night on the couch because it was too hot in the bedroom. The old hag stood over him and gave him a disturbing grin, showing her putrid green gums and missing teeth, and the hag's skin was scaly and covered in sores and pus. Without warning, she jumped onto Jack. The smell coming from her was unbearable as she pinned him to the bed. She seemed to be enjoying herself, enjoying Jack's torment, as she reached into his pyjama bottoms and, well, you can guess the rest. Jack claimed that he was raped by this old vile hag as he lay helpless in bed, and when the demon had finished, just simply disappeared. This sexual assault by the demon shook Jack to the core as he lay sobbing in the bathroom whilst Janet tried to comfort him. Later, he would enter the shower and wash the remnants of the demon's putrid pus from his aching body. The physical evidence on his body was all that he needed to convince himself that this had really happened. Also, strangely, his daughter Dawn claimed that she had a dream that her father had been sexually assaulted by an old hag with pus-filled sores all over her body. Is it possible that whilst assaulting Jack, the demon was also showing Dawn what it was doing in her own dreams? To torment the girl as well as tormenting the father? A few nights after this shocking attack, the demon also sexually assaulted Janet. She felt that she was being fondled as she lay asleep in bed. The Smurls had tried on many occasions to ask the church to perform an exorcism and on multiple occasions been refused. It would seem the church was not convinced of the story. Now, one part of the story that I found interesting was when Janet actually managed to convince a priest named Father Michaels to help them. He was very nice and very helpful, and he spoke to Janet over the phone. And Janet finally felt a little bit of hope in a hopeless situation. But it turned out that there was no Father Michaels in the district. Jack had a friend who was a priest who also confirmed this. Is it possible that the demon was messing with her on the phone, mimicking this non-existent Father Michaels? Who knows? The Warrens returned, this time with their grandson Chris McKinnell, who was also a demonologist. He walked the house once again and he saw more of the activity, and this time caught some unusual sounds on his tape recorder. It sounded like animals were running around the house, running all along the walls and the ceiling, and he also caught the sound of a pig squealing. It was actually Chris that managed to get the Smurls a priest to perform the exorcism after insisting that the family needed help desperately. Enter Father Robert E. McKenna, the man who would finally perform the exorcism for the Swirls, not one but many. Father Robert E. McKenna had performed over 50 exorcisms, including the one done at Amateurville, and out of these 50, 20 had been successful. The priest went from room to room carrying out the exorcism, and there was no retaliation from the demon. It was only when they reached the kitchen when all hell broke loose. From upstairs came the horrible sound of a child screaming, and it could be heard above their heads. But there were no children up there. This was a demon, and it was also opening and slamming every cupboard door in the kitchen over and over again. And then the screaming intensified, like the child was having a tantrum. And then it all stopped, everything was quiet, and from out of nowhere came a delightful smell of roses, a sign that the exorcism had actually worked. But at this point, the Smurls hoped but did not hold their breath. After all, so far this demon had been insisting it was a permanent fixture within this duplex. And unfortunately, the exorcism only seemed to piss off the demon. It retaliated hours later as Jack and Janet's 16-year-old daughter stepped into the shower. At first, everything seemed okay, until she felt a presence standing straight behind her in the shower, and then the feeling of a ghostly, ice-cold hand running down her back. She jumped from the shower screaming for her parents. The exorcism had not worked. It had only angered the demon, who continued to attack the family. This included biting and scratching, and the foul smells made a return, and the poor dog Simon was also targeted by the demon. As one day Janet left to go shopping, she locked the door and she locked the dog outside. When she returned, the dog was locked in the living room. The house was completely locked up. There is no way the dog could have got back into the house. It was almost as though the dog teleported from the backyard into the house. When the family needed to use the bathroom, Jack would now sit outside the door in case a demon decided to attack. On one occasion, whilst Janet was actually sat in the tub, she felt movement under the water around her ankles. As the soap suds started to rise, as something beneath the water rose to the surface. It was a bald-headed troll-like creature covered in a strange oozing substance. Janet didn't waste any more time and she jumped out of the tub screaming, and as she turned around the creature was gone, but the oozing substance remained in the water. On another occasion, whilst Jack smoked a cigarette in his favourite chair whilst watching a western, he noticed an apparition of a young man with shoulder-length fur appear in the living room, and he was staring directly at Jack. And out of shock, Jack dropped his cigarette, and he tried desperately to pick it up, and with this, the ghostly young man gave a crooked smile and vanished. The Smurls were at breaking point. They decided it would be a good idea to get away from the house to go on a little camping trip. The family were now a shadow of the former self, and desperately needed to get away. And so the Smurls packed up and left for their trip. Their teenage cousin Davy joined them, and so did the entity. And on one particular night, whilst the family sat around the campfire roasting marshmallows, Jack noticed a dog had seen something in the bushes, something he didn't like as he was growling. Jack looked over to the spot in the bushes only to see a young girl standing there in the shadows. But it was clear to see that she was not in her right time period. The clothing she wore resembled something that she would have worn back in the Civil War era, not in the 1980s. But what really gave it away was a disturbing smile she had on her face. Jack knew that smile. He had seen it before, in his home, painted on the face of the monstrous things around the house. The little girl smiled directly at Jack and then vanished, but then she suddenly reappeared in a different position with the same look on her face, and then she vanished again. Jack shone his flashlight into the bushes, looking for any sign of the girl, and she didn't disappoint as a beam of light floated past her grinning face, and then she vanished again. As the family settled for bed in the camper, a voice could be heard from the other side of the lake shouting help. Jack stayed with the kids, and Janet, Dawn, and their teenage cousin Davy went to investigate, but found no one apart from a trash can that started to spin of its own accord. It was clear to see that wherever the Smurls went, the demon followed. And just like before when they returned from their last family break, the activity intensified. Mary was once again levitated from her bed, Shannon was actually thrown from the top of her bunk bed, and the eerie shadow man appeared more and more next to the toy box. And there was more sexual assaults carried out on Janet, and it also tried to choke her. A few months after the first exorcism, Father Robert E. McKenna returned. They needed to give it one last try. This time he went from room to room reading out a blessing and then blessed each one of the Smurl family members, including poor Simon the dog. And after this, for 3 whole days, the Smurls experienced some kind of normality. It was as though the heaviness had lifted and maybe now life would resume. Maybe now the demon was gone. It wasn't. I'm not sure if the blessing weakened it or if it was just playing with the family, making them believe it was gone, giving them false hope. But on the 3rd night, it returned, banging on the walls, waking the Smurl family from their sleep. The banging went on along the hallway, and the family had the sense that the demon was very angry, and then it suddenly stopped, and the Smurls returned to their beds, but I'm sure they did not sleep easy that night. A few nights later, the entity levitated Jack and Janet whilst they slept on the mattress, tossing them from side to side. The children appeared at their door and watched in horror as a mattress and their parents came crashing down. There was also something new happening. In the bathroom, as Janet took baths, she could hear the sound of a man groaning with sexual pleasure. And on one night, as Janet ventured to the bathroom, she pushed open the door and was greeted with the presence of the black mass that had been seen so many times at the beginning of the haunting. But this time, it slightly had the shape of a human. Not entirely, but almost. And it looked as though it had formed hands that was trying in vain to open the towel cabinet. But for some reason, it was not succeeding. To me, this seemed like a sign that it was weakening. But going off all the paranormal activity that came after this, it didn't seem like it had weakened at all. One night as the Smurls lay asleep in their bed, Janet awoke at 3 a.m. to see the apparition of a whole kitchen table covered with a lace tablecloth. and an old woman sat at the table with white hair, wearing a long old dress and sweater covering her arms. She sat there smiling at Janet, looking at her through her glasses, before her and the table simply faded away. Now, the strange thing about this apparition, Janet didn't feel scared of it. I'm sure she was shocked to see it sitting there at her bed, but she wasn't scared of it. It was almost a calm, pleasant feeling to see this old lady sat in front of her. It wasn't vicious. It wasn't there with ill intent. And if you remember, Lorraine Warren actually said that there was 3 spirits. There was a violent man, a violent girl, and an old lady who was helpless. And it makes you wonder whether this was actually the old lady. The next day, as Janet did her housework, feeling very tired and weary, she heard a knock at the door, and she could see a brilliant light coming through the little windows in the front door that led out onto the porch. And when Janet swung open the front door, she was greeted by an apparition of a woman who seemed to glow. She was giving off this brilliant, blinding white light. And regardless of this white, blinding light, Janet could still make out the features of the ghostly woman before she simply vanished. This ghostly lady made 2 more appearances to Janet that same day inside the house, and every time she emitted a blinding white light. Now, it doesn't actually say in the book whether Janet felt threatened by this or not, but to me it sounds like a friendly spirit, but I'm not entirely sure because it doesn't clarify this in the book. But to me it sounds somewhat different to the other spirits in the house. Maybe. Now, it was clear to the Smurls that blessings, exorcisms, all leaving the house was not going to work. They needed help from someone else. They didn't know who, but the only way to acquire this help was to go public. So far, only a few neighbours knew of the supposed haunting. And even some of those neighbours claimed that the ghosts were now haunting them and they had actually turned on the family. But what the Smurls did next took their story beyond the street and the neighbourhood they lived on. The Smurls headed out to Philadelphia to appear on a TV show called People Are Talking, presented by Richard Bay, to tell their story. And whilst appearing on this TV show, the Smurls' identities would remain a secret. The Smurls were interviewed behind a dark screen to hide their identities. Questions were asked, like why have you not left the house? Ed answered for the Smurls, informing the audience that the entity follows the family wherever they go. Father Robert E. McKenna was also on the show, telling his side of the story by phone. And then the Smurls told their story in length, touching on how hard it was to receive help from the church, and also how the haunting seemed to be passed on to some of their friends and family, which actually freaked out the audience members because they did not want to be followed home by a vengeful entity. They also told the audience that they had actually been haunted by the entity on their way up to Philadelphia. It actually took a back seat in Janet and Jack's car and proceeded to hit the back of Jack's car until Janet leaned over and sprinkled holy water on the back seat. It was also present in the hotel room, so it actually came with them. And once again, when Jack and Janet returned home, the attacks started again. Janet was once again levitating and thrown around the room as Jack was in a trance, something that was becoming the norm. And if I'm honest, I myself am tiring of repeating the same old stuff. But according to the case, this is what happened over and over again. It was very, very repetitive. The next bit of information is a little bit different. On one night, Jack awoke and looked to the end of the bed to see a gigantic creature with a pig-like snout dripping with snot. It stood there staring at him through burning red eyes. Its head was covered with fur, and it started clawing at the air and growling as though it was getting ready to attack. And Jack let out an awful scream, which awoke Janet. And Janet couldn't see anything. Whatever Jack was seeing, she couldn't see it, and he had to suffer through this alone until it vanished. Now, Jack would see this creature for a second time, and on that occasion he noticed that the bottom half of the creature was not unlike the back legs of a goat or a horse, and to his horror this time it gave chase. It actually chased after him as he ran to his bedroom for the holy water and the Bible, and when the demon saw that he had his Bible and his holy water, it retreated through the wall. On another night, whilst Jack was asleep, Janet lay awake, and at some point in the night she noticed a white mist that rolled through the open window and took the form of a man who had 2 horns on the top of his head, a tash, and glowing green eyes. And there he stood, just stirring, an intense stir. He looked somewhat angry. Janet reached for the holy water, and the phantom started to break up and back into a mist that vanished through the window. It seemed that every time there was a blessing or an exorcism performed, the demon became more and more active. Now, the Smurls took another camping trip. This time, Jack's parents came along. Getting away from the house had seemed pointless before because the demon followed, but it was also a better option for the Smurls than staying in the house. Now, the demon did indeed follow again, attacking Murray's bed while she slept, and a few nights later it did the same to John. Only this time, as John was struggling to stay on top of the mattress that was now floating in the air, he noticed a figure outside of the camper that emitted a brilliant white glow before it turned and walked away. On another night, the family awoke to the sound of hooved animals running across the roof of the camper, and the Smurls also noticed that sitting outside, admiring the fire, was a demon in its black mass form. It was admiring a fire that had been extinguished before the Smurls went to bed, but here it was, once again, ablaze. The Smurls cut their camping trip short. It was not as relaxing as they thought, but they knew it wouldn't be. They knew that wherever they went, this demon was sure to follow, and the future just seemed hopeless. When the Smurls returned home, they were greeted by the offensive smell the demon liked to produce, but this time it was somewhat worse. It smelled like human waste. The following morning, Janet awoke in an empty bed. Jack must have got up extra early than Janet. Just as she was about to get out of bed, a hand rose from the mattress as though someone lay within the mattress. Before Janet could jump out of the bed, the hand grabbed her by the neck and held her in place. And when this happened, Janet felt angry and she felt tired, and she just cried out to the demon that it should just kill her. She was done, she had had enough, and with that it simply just let her go. Just as always, the activity continued to ramp up. The white phantom was seen by John's mother, as well as another bizarre-looking dog that ran through her living room, like the headless dog that she had once seen before, but this dog was generally just deformed instead of headless. There was disembodied voices that could be heard all around the house, including the sound of a cat crying from the closet, and of course, there was no cat inside. Shannon, one of the Smurl's daughters, would also see the man in black looking through her toy box, claiming that he looked right at her with empty holes where his eyes should be. And Jack was put through another sexual assault. The Smurls had already gone public, but very little had come of it. For one, their identity was not revealed, and they made the decision to go to the press and tell their story in full and give their identities, and basically risk public ridicule. It was the only idea that they had left. They needed help, and they asked for it in an article that was published in the local paper. But not much help came. It kind of became like a circus. Other newspapers would contact them for their story. Cars came and went all day long just to look at the house. People began standing right in front of the property, asking questions and showing concern, poking fun, peering through the windows. And random people would camp outside the house, sit on the side wall, or even climb trees to peer into the house windows. And the Smurls' neighbours were even being interviewed by reporters. They were asking if they thought the Smurls had created a hoax or could they be telling the truth. Some neighbours even claimed that they were now being haunted, whilst others insisted that their children would not be playing with the Smurl children any longer. Another neighbour insisted that she had rang Janet the night that they were at their camping trip, and a little girl answered the phone. The attention was now getting out of hand. The amount of visitors was excessive for this quiet little street, and there were also people there just to be there. There was people there to cause trouble, and some angrily demanding that the Smurls prove that their house was haunted, and of course some people there claiming that they had seen the entity past the window. The reporters that did make it onto the property also reported that they witnessed paranormal activity whilst in the house, but this was most likely to sell more papers. Whilst inside the house, the Smurls felt trapped by the decision that they had made. But one day Janet received a phone call from a psychic, a lady called Maurice Alice Rinkman, and for some reason Janet decided to trust this woman. Out of the many offers of help she had received from the public, this felt different somehow. It was not long before Maurice Alice Rinkman turned up at the duplex on Chase Street, pushed through the crowd, and knocked on the door. Once inside, after pleasantries were exchanged, the psychic began to walk the house room to room, just like Lorraine had done. When Murray stopped in the basement, she felt something. She turned to the Smurls to tell them that there was a spirit of an old woman with them in the basement. Murray told them that this old woman looked confused, but was harmless. In Dawn and Heather's bedroom, Murray said she could see the spirit of a man with a mustache and his name was Patrick. She said he was not a nice man and he was very, very angry. Murray also picked up on another spirit, the spirit of a woman, and her name was Elizabeth. Patrick was a husband, but he wasn't a very good husband, and in life he would beat her quite often. One day, Elizabeth found comfort in the arms of another man. Patrick returned home, found them, and killed her lover with his bare fists, and then strangled Elizabeth to death in the house. This happened in the 1800s. Patrick was found by a lynch mob, and they hung him for his crimes. The psychic also informed Janet that she looked like Elizabeth, and the spirit of Patrick was taking his hatred out on Janet and Jack. She also added that the spirit was afraid to pass over because of his evil deed and was not sure if he would be welcomed. The psychic also revealed another spirit that was violent and mentally ill in his living years. She added that the demon in the house is very dangerous and it was controlling the other spirits. The Smurls were also visited by a movie star, the actor Jason Miller, who had played Father Damien Karras in the movie The Exorcist. It seemed that he had taken an interest in the paranormal after the filming of the horror movie, which apparently had its own trouble concerning paranormal activity whilst filming. And Jason Miller showed a lot of interest in the Smurl family haunting, and he came round to the house, and the Smurl family showed him around the rooms and told him of all the different hauntings and the paranormal activity that had taken place. And before he left, he gave them little bits of advice from what he had learned from the paranormal. And this as well actually reached the local newspapers. And if you go over to Google and type in Jason Miller and the Smurl family haunting, you will actually see the actual article that was printed with Jason Miller standing there in front of the house. It is very interesting. Now, by going public with the story, the Smurls and the Warrens would come under heavy scrutiny by the Committee of the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. I'm going to say that again because I quite enjoyed it. The Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal claimed that they wanted to help by putting the family up in a hotel whilst they investigated the property, but the Warrens and the Smurls refused, claiming that the organisation had already made up its mind, and this was seen as a massive red flag. The Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal went to the press claiming it was all a hoax, a money-making game, revealing the Smurls were already in the process of signing a movie deal. Which isn't untrue, as in the early 90s this story was told in a TV movie, even though the Smurls insisted that they were not interested in the money and they did not receive any. And that would be the same straight-to-TV movie that I watched when I was a kid that absolutely terrified me. It's the first time I was introduced to this case through that movie. Like I said before, it's available on YouTube if you want to go and seek it out and watch it. It's not the greatest quality, but it's there and it's free and you can experience it for yourself. It's a little bit dated, but I still think it's pretty good. In the end, the church had no option but to help, and they sent priests to investigate and stay over the night in the house. And on that night, there was absolutely no paranormal activity. The Smurls claimed that the demon was simply laying low to escape another exorcism attempt. The Smurls and the Warrens did their own mass exorcism, bringing in several priests and prayer groups. Eventually, Robert McKenna would return to perform one last exorcism with as much conviction as he could muster. And when he was done, the smell of roses was once again in the air, and the activity died down. This time, it seemed for good. After several weeks of peace and quiet, the Smurls gave a statement that the activity had finally come to an end and all was well, and they wished to get on with their lives. Weeks turned into months, and still no activity. Life was finally starting to look up after all these years of hell. Christmas came, a happy time that the Smurls could now enjoy more than ever before. And on one particular night, as the family all slept soundly in their beds, Jack sat down in front of the TV with the glow of the Christmas tree shining upon him. It wasn't over. The demon appeared in its black mask form and made its way to the middle of the room and proceeded to follow Jack up the stairs as Jack demanded in the name of Jesus Christ that the demon be gone, and eventually it vanished. That night, the house once again came alive with bangs, the walls vibrated, the mimicking continued, and of course the foul stench filled the family's nostrils. After this, the Smurls at last decided to pack up and leave the duplex behind. This was their last resort and hoped that the demon did not follow. Not long after the Smurls left Chase Street, they headed into the sunset to move into their new home. But you guessed it, the demon did indeed follow them. Now, the book that I used for this episode, The History and Haunting of the Smurl Family Horror, tells us that apparently one of the Smurl sisters, Karen, gave an interview in 2016 claiming that herself and her sister were down in the basement of the new house, which had been set up as a TV room with a bar area, and at one point Karen was left alone in the basement when she heard a familiar banging coming from the ceiling, and then the walls, and then the basement door slammed shut, and Karen ran from the basement as fast as she could, crying for her dad, hinting that the entity did indeed follow them to their new home. I'm not sure whether the paranormal activity was as regular as it was in the other house, but going off this interview, it simply didn't leave them alone. Now, it seems that this story does not really have a happy ending. The haunting continued, maybe in a lesser form, but they never really were rid of the paranormal activity. And according to the book I used to source this information, The History and Haunting of the Smurl Family Horror, eventually Jack's parents passed away, as did Jack in 2017, whilst Janet is still alive and well and lives with one of her daughters, and the Smurl sisters are now adults and have children of their own, and they still see strange things from time to time. It's worth mentioning that after the Smurls left the duplex on Chase Street, there has been no other mention of demonic forces or ghostly happenings on that property. But if the demon did indeed move with the Smurls, that would kind of make sense. So what do you think? Was the Smurl family haunting real? Did it actually happen? Or was it just simply a hoax that was carried on over a 15-year period? As always, I'll let you decide. Take care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you very, very soon for another episode of Bizarre Podcast. See you guys. Bye-bye.